Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a bleak November morning, the kind that smothers London in a dreary cloak of mist, when a case arrived that would confound even the most seasoned minds of Scotland Yard. Holmes had risen earlier than usual and stood by the window of our Baker Street lodgings, gazing at the curling fog with the focused attachment I had come to associate with an incoming mystery. I had barely poured my second cup of tea when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose very appearance seemed to carry the weight of scandal. He was thin, pale, and overdressed with the damp, his cravat too tight, his gloves too fine for honest labor, and his boots still dusted with the gray chalk of Surrey. Yet what struck me most was his face, composed, aristocratic, but marred by a deep unease that no refinement could hide. "Mr. Holmes," he said, removing his gloves with trembling fingers, "I am Sir Lionel Barraclough of Greystone Manor, and I fear I bring you a puzzle most impossible." Holmes turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "Impossible, Sir Lionel? That is a bold claim. Please have a seat. Watson, your notes." I reached for my pocketbook, already sensing that whatever this man was about to say, it would warrant more than passing interest. Sir Lionel perched on the edge of the armchair, like a man trying not to disturb a trap. "I woke yesterday morning to find the west wing of Greystone Manor entirely sealed from within, bolted doors, shuttered windows, no sign of forced entry or exit. Yet inside, in the library, lay the body of my brother, Horace, stabbed once in the chest. No weapon, no footprints, and this is what chills me, Mr. Holmes, a perfect, unbroken line of dust across the floor leading from the hearth to the study door." Holmes sat upright. "A line of dust?" "Yes, not smudged, not disturbed. As if—" He paused, searching for the right absurdity. "As if something had passed through the room without touching the floor." Holmes turned his head sharply. "And your brother?" "Alone. The windows were barred from the inside, and the only door to the room was locked. I had to summon the housekeeper to fetch the spare key. No one else could have entered." I leaned forward. "Was there any sign of suicide?" Sir Lionel shook his head firmly. "The wound was in the back, straight and clean. My brother had enemies, no doubt. He was formidable in business, but no one could have entered that room." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded. "A locked-room murder, and a line of dust which no man could have stepped across without breaking. Fascinating." Sir Lionel nodded gravely. "The local constables believe it must have been an intruder from the servants' quarters. But there's no route, none, that does not involve breaking that line. Has anyone crossed it since?" I ordered the room sealed. "I thought, perhaps a mind like yours—" "You did well, Sir Lionel," Holmes interrupted. "Tell me about your brother, his character, his habits, and, if you please, his recent associations." Sir Lionel exhaled heavily. "Horace was difficult, intelligent beyond measure, arrogant. He inherited the family estate, but resented its responsibilities. He had recently returned from the continent. Italy, I believe. He spent long hours in that library, sketching diagrams, writing strange letters, talking of secrets hidden in symbols and old architecture." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Was he a scholar?" "In his own way. He called it esoteric engineering, whatever that means. He said architecture was a key to understanding human behavior. He believed rooms could influence thought." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, rising. "Watson, make ready. We leave for Greystone Manor within the hour." "But Holmes," I said, "we've no tangible clue. Only a dead man and a line of dust." He smiled, the faintest glint of excitement flickering in his eyes. "Exactly, Watson. A man may lie, but dust tells the truth." Chapter 2. The Arrival at Greystone Manor. The train journey to Surrey was draped in gray mist and muffled silence. Holmes, as was his habit during moments of intense thought, sank into the far corner of our compartment, arms crossed, chin dipped low, and eyes nearly shut. From time to time, his fingers would twitch, as though measuring some invisible geometry only he could see. I busied myself watching Sir Lionel Barraclough, who sat opposite us, his shoulders tense, gaze flicking now and then to Holmes. I could tell he wished to speak, to press for some early theory or hopeful declaration. But Holmes offered none. Instead, he broke his silence only once. "You said your brother had an interest in symbols?" he asked suddenly. Sir Lionel started. "Yes. Well, in symbols, old architecture, the meanings of rooms, even the geometry of hallways. He once redesigned the breakfast parlor because he claimed the angles were spiritually dissonant." Holmes nodded, as if that confirmed something. "What was his profession?" "He'd no need for one," Sir Lionel replied. "But he styled himself an intellectual architect, claimed he was writing a book that would change how mankind thought about space." "Space indeed," Holmes murmured. Then he resumed his silence. By the time we arrived at Greystone Station, dusk had settled. A chilled wind cut across the platform as we disembarked. Waiting for us was a black carriage emblazoned with a Barraclough crest, its driver bundled in a thick wool coat and silent save for a respectful nod to Sir Lionel. As the horses carried us down winding country roads, Holmes turned to our host. "Tell me, Sir Lionel, how long had you and your brother lived together?" He hesitated. "Only 6 months. I returned from India last spring." Horace had already taken up residence. Our father left his estate to him. Being the elder, my return was inconvenient, I suspect. "You quarreled?" "Not openly. But he was a difficult man to live with. Reclusive, possessive. He treated Greystone as though it were a vault guarding some ancient secret. The trees thinned, and Greystone Manor rose from the moor like a brooding sentinel. The house was vast, its silhouette cut sharp against the indigo sky, with towers that leaned inward and chimneys that speared upward like ancient battlements. It was not the comforting sprawl of an English country house, but something older, sterner. Its very design seemed to discourage intimacy. Holmes took one long look at the building as we stepped out. "Built in 1624, he remarked. "Stone quarried locally. Flemish influence in the chimneys. But the western wing, added later, I'd wager. 1870s. Your brother's doing?" Sir Lionel looked startled. "Yes, how did you know?" "The stonework is less weathered, and the windows are narrower. Curious, for a man who so revered design, to break symmetry like that." Sir Lionel led us to the heavy oak doors and into a grand foyer lined with oil portraits. The house was unervingly silent, and the faint scent of dust and cold stone clung to every surface. A maid, white-faced and tight-lipped, took our coats without a word. "We've sealed the library," Sir Lionel said. "As you requested. Nothing's been touched." Holmes nodded. "I will examine it shortly. But first, your brother's quarters, if you please." We were led up a narrow staircase and down a corridor dimly lit by gas lamps. The walls bore faded wallpaper patterned with ivy, and I noted odd geometric carvings at each doorframe. Triangles nested within circles and inverted pentagons at the corners. The entire effect was unsettling. "Horace drew those himself," Sir Lionel said, noticing my interest. "He claimed the angles kept the house in harmony." Holmes stopped before the last door. "And yet he died in discord." Inside, Horace Barraclough's chambers were sparse but meticulously arranged. A desk lined with notebooks, a single bed, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with volumes in Latin, Greek, and some I did not recognize. On the wall hung a blueprint of the manor's west wing, labeled not with room names, but with symbols, concentric squares, spiral notations, stars. Holmes examined the shelves, fingers trailing along spines. He pulled a book half an inch out, then let it slide back. "The pattern of sacred geometry," he muttered. "And this, the Architectura Obscura, a rare one." He crouched to examine a stack of papers on the desk. "Watson, look at this. A diagram of the library. And here, what do you make of this?" He handed me a parchment filled with delicate ink lines. It was a map of the library floor, but segmented into unfamiliar shapes. Triangles nested in curves, dotted lines, arrows pointing to specific corners. "I can't make sense of it," I admitted. "Nor should you," Holmes replied. "It is a design intended not for comfort or function, but for influence. Your brother believed the room could manipulate behavior. Perhaps he was right, though not in the way he expected." We returned downstairs, following Sir Lionel to the sealed library. 2 constables stood watch, eyes widening at the sight of Holmes. "Inspector Lestrade sends his regards," one said. "Told us to keep everything untouched." Holmes examined the lock. "You used the spare key to open this after discovering the body?" Sir Lionel nodded. "Yes. The original was with Horace, in his pocket." Holmes retrieved a magnifying lens from his coat. He bent to inspect the doorframe, then the floor. "Dust here, disturbed slightly. A left-handed person opened this." "You, Sir Lionel?" "I am left-handed, yes." Holmes made a note. Then he turned the key, and the library opened to us. I will confess, the sight within sent a shiver through me. It was a circular room, its shelves rising 2 stories high, packed with leather-bound books. At the center lay a heavy oak desk. Behind it, a high-backed chair now toppled, and on the floor, crumpled awkwardly near the hearth, lay the chalk outline of a man. The bloodstain had dried to brown. There was no weapon in sight. But what caught the eye instantly was the line. It stretched from the hearth to the door, a single narrow trail of undisturbed dust, bisecting the room cleanly. No footprints crossed it, not even scuff marks. On either side, the dust showed clear signs of movement, shoes, dragging cloth, even small drops of blood. But the line remained unbroken. Immaculate. Holmes stood still for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "This is not just a line, Watson. This is a statement. Someone wanted us to see this, to wonder." He crouched beside it, not touching, just observing. "Someone went to great lengths to preserve this illusion," he murmured. "And illusions, my dear Watson, are the favorite tools of murderers." Chapter 3. The first clues a scene of deception. Holmes did not speak for a full minute. He merely observed, his keen gray eyes darting from one section of the room to the next, as though reading invisible text written across the air itself. I have seen him silent before, but this was different. It was reverent, as if the room were a riddle whispered by death itself, and he dared not interrupt it too soon. The library's strange geometry only grew more oppressive the longer we lingered. The circular room narrowed slightly at one side, the walls drawing in not symmetrically, but at an angle that made the space feel subtly distorted. The shelves climbed higher there, too, and I noticed how the books themselves were arranged not by author or subject, but by size, creating a sweeping visual rhythm, as though the room were less a place of reading than a kind of instrument, a mechanism. Holmes finally spoke. "Watson, your lantern. Bring it close." I obeyed, stepping carefully around the undisturbed dust line. Holmes had produced a folded caliper from his pocket and began measuring the space between the footprints leading from the fireplace to the window. "Interesting," he muttered. "The right foot drags slightly more than the left. But note this, every step is angled outward at precisely the same degree. Not the gait of a man walking in fear. More likely," he trailed off, rising and pacing the edge of the room's circle. Sir Lionel stood at the door, arms crossed. "The dust line," he said, "makes no sense. We've no creatures in the house, no mechanical devices. It simply should not exist." Holmes raised a finger. "But it does. And that, Sir Lionel, is the central fact. The world as it should be is irrelevant. We deal with what is." He knelt again near the hearth, his fingers brushing the rug but never crossing the line. He sniffed at the edge of the carpet. "Ah," he said quietly. "Now we approach something useful." "What is it?" I asked. Holmes turned to me with a small smile. "Salt, Watson." A fine line of it lay just beneath the rug's edge, along the exact track of the dust, mixed with a trace of powdered gypsum, a curious blend, natural chalk and salt, fine enough to appear as dust, but distinct under the nose. "Someone created a line?" I asked, incredulous. "Indeed, not merely created it, engineered it." This was a deliberate visual barrier, meant to imply significance, like the chalk circles drawn in children's games, or the wards in ancient folklore. He rose, brushing his knees. Someone wanted anyone entering this room to pause, to wonder, to hesitate. Sir Lionel stepped inside the threshold, his voice low. "My brother believed symbols had power, that certain shapes could influence human perception. Could this salt line be one of them?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned to the desk. It was heavy, ornate, and stained with ink near the inkwell, though the blotter had been removed. Holmes ran his finger over the surface. "No fingerprints," he murmured. "Wiped clean. But look here. Scratches. Small, fine, and angled." He stepped behind the desk. Crouching beside the toppled chair. See this groove on the back leg? A splintered indentation. The chair fell hard, but in a direction inconsistent with someone collapsing backward. I knelt beside him, heart beginning to race. "You mean?" Holmes leaned closer, examining the faint signature in the corner. "This may seem an odd question, Miss Hartley, but did your sister ever express fears for her safety?" Lillian hesitated, not in so many words, but she had moods, sudden shifts. She'd laugh one moment and stare blankly the next, as though a shadow passed over her. She didn't mention any particular person, any threats. She was secretive, even with me, especially these last few weeks. Holmes's gaze darkened with interest. "Was there a man?" "A man," she echoed, visibly startled. "Well, yes, perhaps. I never met him, but I found notes, letters, torn pieces in the wastebasket. She must have burned the rest." "What did the notes say?" "Nothing detailed, only phrases. You mustn't trust him. And once. He knows about Paris." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "Paris. Curious. Was she there recently?" Lillian shook her head. "Not since last autumn." "Did you notice any changes upon her return?" "She was restless, obsessed with redecorating. She removed the old dressing table, the one we inherited from our grandmother, and bought a new one." Holmes leaned forward. "What became of the old dressing table?" "It's in the cellar, I believe. If I may see it?" She nodded, puzzled. "Of course." Watson and I followed Holmes and Miss Hartley down the narrow staircase into the dim, musty cellar. Cobwebs clung to the beams, and dust curled beneath our boots. In the far corner stood the dressing table, a handsome mahogany piece, carved in the Art Nouveau style. The mirror was cracked, and one of the legs had splintered slightly. Holmes examined it with a reverent intensity. He ran his fingers beneath the drawers, tapped the wood for false bottoms, then paused at the back panel. With his penknife, he loosened the frame and gently pried it off. A folded photograph fell into his hand. He opened it slowly. It showed Annabel Hartley in a garden, standing close, too close, to a man, a tall, dark figure with a neat beard and aristocratic bearing. They weren't smiling. Their expressions were tense, guarded. A date was written faintly in ink along the corner. Paris, September. Holmes turned to Lillian, holding out the photograph. "Do you recognize the man?" She paled, taking the picture with trembling fingers. "No, I've never seen him." "Then he is not a relative?" "Absolutely not." Holmes slipped on a glove and retrieved the photograph. "May I keep this in my records?" She nodded faintly. We returned to the parlor. Holmes was quiet for several moments, his eyes closed, fingertips pressed together. Then he asked, "Was your sister acting the night of her death? Any indication she knew her end was near?" "She was peculiar. She asked for tea and played Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major, her favorite. Then she asked me to leave her alone. Said she needed to write something important." "Did you see any writing on her desk?" "Nothing. I assumed she changed her mind." Holmes stood abruptly. "Miss Hartley, we thank you. I believe we must now pay a visit to the Paris address your sister listed when she applied for her summer theater engagement. I suspect Paris holds more than just memories." As we made our way toward the door, Miss Hartley caught Holmes by the arm. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Mr. Holmes, do you think she was murdered?" Holmes looked her in the eye, unflinching. "I think your sister knew something someone desperately wanted silenced. Whether that silence was paid for in blood remains to be seen." She nodded slowly, and we left her standing in the doorway, her black silhouette framed by the gray morning behind her. Out in the street, Holmes moved briskly. "Come, Watson, we shall stop by Scotland Yard first. I must know if any French nationals have entered the city under false pretenses in the last fortnight, and whether any of them match the man in that photograph. And if they have, then the stage upon which Miss Annabel Hartley died was no fiction at all, but a carefully composed act. And her role? Holmes paused at the edge of the pavement. A lead actress in a play whose final act was written in fear and sealed in silence. Chapter 6. Echoes beneath the floorboards. The morning after the storm had left a peculiar stillness over the manor, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Rain had scrubbed the windows clean, but left muddy trails along the cobblestone paths. Holmes stood at the breakfast table, buttering toast with the absent-minded precision of a surgeon, while his gaze remained fixed on the study door. "I suppose today we examine the hidden room," I ventured, pouring myself a cup of strong black tea. Holmes did not respond immediately. His fingers hovered over the butter knife. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Watson, it is time." We waited until Inspector Halbert arrived. Punctual as ever, he had with him a map of the house retrieved from county archives, an original blueprint dating back to 1821. "It confirms your suspicions," he said, unrolling the parchment across the dining table. "There's a narrow space between the eastern study wall and the butler's pantry. Was likely bricked off during renovations in the 1850s. But look here," he pointed to a series of penciled notes. "There's also mention of a dumbwaiter system, long since removed, which explains the pulley noise Lord Belgrave heard 2 nights ago." Holmes murmured. The sound he mistook for ghostly chains. Without further delay, we gathered tools and returned to the study. Holmes moved quickly, with surgical precision, tapping along the eastern wall with a silver-headed cane until a hollow reverberation betrayed its secret. We pried open the wood paneling to reveal old stone, weakened by time. With Halbert's crowbar and a little force, a segment of the wall gave way. Beyond lay darkness. Holmes ducked inside first. I followed, coughing as dust filled the air, the beam of my lantern catching cobwebs thick as ropes. The air was heavy with the smell of rot, old paper, and something else, something metallic. At that moment, the doorbell rang, followed by a butler's cautious announcement. "Inspector Gregson, sir. Urgent." Holmes straightened as Gregson entered, slightly out of breath. "Gentlemen, you'll want to hear this." He removed his bowler. 2 constables found a man's body floating in the Thames near Battersea, matching Lord Merryweather's description. But there's something strange. Watson tensed. "He's alive?" Gregson shook his head. "Dead, yes, but the face, it's been disfigured. Acid, likely. No way to confirm identity visually. No ID, no rings. Just this." He held out a torn scrap of leather. Holmes took it carefully, turning it over. Embossed into the grain was a symbol, a hound with its tongue pierced by a dagger. Watson squinted. "I've seen that before, on the brass button we found in Merryweather's study." Holmes's expression darkened. "Indeed, it is the crest of Society of the Thorn Tongue, a clandestine group tied to political coercion, blackmail, and silence by force. They were believed defunct since the Algernon Papers trial, but—" He stepped toward the firelight. The scrap held up to the flames flicker. They're resurfacing. Eleanor, pale and trembling, gripped the edge of the mantel. "My husband once mentioned that name. He said some secrets rot the soul faster than poison." Holmes turned to her sharply. "Did he ever speak of a man named Ashby?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, General Ashby, a guest at our estate 2 years ago. A strange man. They argued. After that, James burned several letters." Holmes's voice was low. "General Silas Ashby is a known associate of Lord Merryweather's past dealings in colonial intelligence. If he's involved—" Gregson interjected. "We believe Ashby left for France last week, but we flagged all ports. Still, if Merryweather is truly dead, Ashby may be our only lead." Holmes said, "We must visit Merryweather's estate. There are roots buried deeper than this letter or this body. Something else lies beneath the rose garden." He mentioned the garden mirror, as he called it. Watson stepped forward. "The housekeeper said no one's entered the garden shed in over a year. Perhaps—" "Exactly." Holmes's eyes lit with that rare flare of certainty. "The mirror, not a metaphor, a literal object, hiding in plain sight. He turned to Eleanor. I asked you to remain in town. Your safety may be in question. But was my husband. If he's dead, I must know why. Holmes's voice softened. And you shall. But we must tread where the thorns are thickest and where names, once spoken, tend to vanish. Within the hour, they were back in the black cab, the city's shadows growing thicker with night. Holmes sat stiffly, the confession letter in hand, eyes narrowed in thought. Watson finally broke the silence. Do you believe Merriweather was murdered? Holmes replied without looking up. Watson, I do not believe he ever left the city, and I do not yet believe he is dead. Watson stared. But the body? Too convenient, too staged. The disfigurement, the lack of identification, a message disguised as a corpse. And the leather scrap was planted. This was a performance for us. As the cab rattled toward Merriweather's estate, Holmes whispered, The ghost we pursue is not a man, but shadow of a lie. And now we're entering its den. Chapter 8. The Portrait and the Perfume. The next morning broke with a gray sky and mist clinging low over the rooftops of Calbourne. Inspector Harrow arrived at Thornbridge Hall just after sunrise, his boots crunching over the damp gravel as he met Holmes and Watson on the front steps. Holmes, already dressed in a deep olive traveling coat, greeted him with a nod. Inspector, you've had the letters examined. I have, Harrow replied. The ink on the threatening letter was ordinary, nothing distinctive. But the paper, that was different. It's French, a brand not commonly sold here. A boutique stationer's in Mayfair sells it, under the name Papeterie de Minuit. Only a few dozen clients have purchased it over the last year. Excellent, Holmes said with a gleam in his eye. We'll follow that trail shortly. But before we head to London, there's something in this house still unsettled. Watson adjusted his collar against the morning chill. What do you suspect, Holmes? Holmes turned his gaze toward the east wing of Thornbridge. The gallery. I noticed yesterday a peculiar odor near the portrait of Lady Charlotte, the Countess's grandmother, a faint trace of jasmine, not unlike the scent that lingered on the letter. Surely that's a coincidence, said Harrow. Holmes arched a brow. Coincidence is the comfort of the unimaginative, Inspector. Come. They entered the gallery, its stained glass windows casting soft colors over ancient oil paintings. Holmes walked slowly, eyes narrowed, until he reached the portrait in question. The painting was grand. Lady Charlotte stood in a field of lavender, a small dog at her feet, her expression noble, almost defiant. Holmes stood before the frame, then reached into his coat for a small glass vial. Uncorking it, he dabbed a bit of powder onto a cloth and pressed it gently against the lower frame. Almost immediately, the powder turned blue. Watson, Holmes said softly, chloroform masked by jasmine oil. Applied here recently. Perhaps something hidden behind this painting. Watson stepped forward. A panel? Let us see. With delicate fingers, Holmes unhooked the frame from his mount and gently lifted it from the wall. Behind it, a wooden panel. Holmes examined the edges and found a small groove. Using a thin blade from his kit, he worked it under the panel until it slid open with a soft click. Inside, a slim wooden box wrapped in velvet. Holmes removed it carefully and laid it on a nearby table. He opened it to reveal nothing but a single photograph, sepia-toned. A man and a woman standing by a fountain. The woman, unmistakably young Countess Helena. The man, older, with a lined face and sharp eyes, unfamiliar to them all. Watson picked up the photo. Who is he? Unknown, said Holmes. But look closely at her hand. She's wearing a wedding ring. This picture predates her marriage to the late Lord Altham. Inspector Harrow whistled. You think she was married before? Possibly. Or, at the very least, romantically entangled. This photo was hidden with considerable care. Why? That is the question. Watson furrowed his brow. And the chloroform? Someone intended to drug the Countess. Perhaps. Or perhaps the portrait was used to hide something for years, and only recently disturbed. We cannot yet know who placed it there, nor when. Holmes folded the velvet wrapping. But the connection between scent secrecy and sentiment is rarely accidental. They returned the gallery to its previous state and made their way back to the drawing room. Lady Altham awaited them there, her demeanor steeled though her eyes were red-rimmed. "You found something," she said quietly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "A photograph, hidden behind your grandmother's portrait." Lady Altham stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Holmes studied her face. "The man in the photo, Lady Altham. Who is he?" She hesitated. "No one of importance." "Your expression says otherwise. You were married to him, weren't you?" A long silence. Then, in a trembling voice, she answered. "His name was Stefan Volkov. I met him in Vienna. I was barely 17. We eloped. I thought it was love." She took a breath. "But he was dangerous, possessive. When I tried to leave, he vanished. I returned to England and married Lord Altham. No one here ever knew. I thought he had died years ago." Holmes nodded. "Then he may be our missing thread." She looked up sharply. "You think he's involved in Lionel's death?" "I think he has reason to return, if he has, and reason to hide. A man spurned, especially one with secrets of his own, is a man worth considering." Lady Altham's hand shook. "If he's here, if he did this—" Watson stepped forward. "There's no proof yet, but we'll find out." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Inspector Harrow, I suggest we travel to London at once. We have a stationer to visit and a photograph to trace." "But the family," Harrow began. Holmes interrupted him with uncharacteristic warmth. "They'll be safe for a day. But if we lose the trail of this man, we may lose the truth." As the three men departed Thornbridge Hall, and the carriage rolled onto the muddy road toward London, Watson leaned out to glance at the great house shrinking in the distance. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing clearer outlines, yet inside the case remained as clouded as ever. "Holmes," Watson said, "what do you think really happened that night in the study?" Holmes, eyes fixed on the horizon, replied, "I think someone opened a door that had been sealed long ago. And now, the past is walking among us." Chapter 9. The Shattered Mirror. The morning sun filtered through the thin drapes of Holmes' Baker Street apartment, catching in motes of dust that danced like slow-moving specters. Watson sat stiffly near the hearth, his tea growing cold in his hand, eyes fixed on Holmes as a detective paced across the room. Every few seconds, Holmes would stop, mutter to himself, and then resume walking, hands behind his back, eyes half-lidded in concentration. "The death of Judge Fenwick," Holmes murmured, "and the stage actor's bizarre performance at Lady Bellamy's, both inexplicably tied to this anonymous letter, and now, Miss Abernathy's disappearance." He turned sharply on his heel. "We are not contending with a single crime, Watson, but with the orchestration of an illusion, like a magician's trick. The misdirection is intentional. You suspect the letter writer is responsible for Miss Abernathy's disappearance?" Watson asked, setting his teacup aside. Holmes didn't answer at once. He moved to his desk, picked up the copy of the unsigned letter they had recovered from Judge Fenwick's effects, and compared it with a new note that had arrived that morning, slipped under their door with no sign of who had delivered it. Both were written in the same peculiar ink, blue-black and fading at the edges, and shared a distinctive downward slant in the letter T. "The same hand, no doubt," Holmes said. "Whoever penned these has a penchant for theatrical. But what truly concerns me is this line: 'The mirror was shattered before the truth could be seen.' A metaphor, yes, but also literal." He turned to Watson, eyes glittering. "Pack your revolver. Old friend, we are going to return to Lady Bellamy's estate." Watson's face paled. "You believe she's involved?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I believe her drawing room holds more secrets than she's willing to admit." The journey to Bellamy Manor was tense and silent. Lady Bellamy received them with a tight smile and a fur-lined shawl, though the weather had warmed slightly. She led them to the same grand room in which the curious performance had occurred days ago. "You said you were here to look again at the stage?" she asked delicately, though her eyes were sharp. Holmes nodded. "Specifically, the mirror behind performer that night, the one that now seems missing." Her lips thinned. "The mirror was shattered, I'm afraid. I had the pieces removed the morning after. A servant knocked it over while cleaning. Quite the coincidence." Holmes said softly. He walked to the now bare wall where the mirror had hung, running a gloved hand along the wallpaper. May we see the pieces? They were discarded. Holmes turned, gaze icy, and no attempt to reassemble them, even when a judge's death was announced hours later and your performer vanished. Lady Bellamy's expression faltered. It was a mirror, Mr. Holmes, not a confession. But it might have contained one, Holmes murmured. Watson cleared his throat. I don't understand. Holmes gestured toward the space where the mirror had been. Consider the angle of the performance stage, the placement of the guests. That mirror reflected not just the actor, but the audience. I suspect someone else was in this room that night. Someone not meant to be seen. Watson straightened. Reflected in the mirror? Holmes nodded. Precisely. Back in Baker Street, the detective reviewed sketches he had taken of the room's layout. He placed markers where Lady Bellamy's guests had been seated, indicating line of sight. Then he drew a rough outline of where the mirror would have stood. Watson hovered behind him. If someone was hidden in the shadows, could they be seen only in the mirror's reflection? That is the trick, Watson, Holmes said. Lady Bellamy insists the performance was meant to shock. The actor's mannerisms, the feverish monologue, the collapsing at the end, it all served to draw attention away from the rest of the room. But the mirror, if glanced at even momentarily, may have revealed a figure standing behind the curtain, watching. He circled the sketch. I believe the mirror showed the true threat that night. Watson frowned. And that's why it was destroyed? Exactly. The person who saw it, who realized the danger, was Miss Abernathy. That evening brought a knock on their door. Lestrade entered, soaked from rain and bearing a folder tucked beneath his arm. I thought you want to see this, he said grimly, setting the folder on the table. We pulled a name from the registry of performers Lady Bellamy hired. Only one that didn't match a real person, one Mr. Marlon Gray. No known actor by that name, but the address he gave us to a long-abandoned theater in Southwark. Holmes perked up. The Draymore Theater? Lestrade blinked. That's the one. Holmes stood at once, gathering his coat and hat. Then we go tonight. Miss Abernathy's life may depend on it. The Draymore Theater was a haunted place. Shuttered for over a decade, its broken sign swung creakily in the damp wind. Inside, mold-stained curtains hung in tatters, and the air smelled of mildew and old paint. They moved carefully through the front, flash lamps sweeping wide arcs across the dust-laden seats. Holmes paused suddenly at the orchestra pit and turned toward the side stage. There, he whispered. Watson followed his gaze and saw a movement. They advanced, revolvers drawn, only to find a lone trunk resting on the stage, its lock broken. Inside lay Miss Abernathy's scarf. Watson's breath caught. She was here. Holmes examined the floor, then pointed to a scuffed trail leading backstage. She may still be. But as they followed it into the darkness, a gust of wind slammed the backstage door shut behind them with a resounding bang, and all light went out. Chapter 10. The Watchmaker's Secret. The morning after the discovery of the coded journal was one of peculiar quiet. The London fog crept to the city like a silent accomplice, casting a pall over the cobbled streets and dampening every sound. Holmes had scarcely slept. I, on the other hand, had been jolted awake by dreams of ticking clocks and whispered threats in the dark. When I joined Holmes in the sitting room of Baker Street, he was already fully dressed, eyes fixed on the code book and scraps of paper that covered the table. He didn't look up. I presume you noticed it too, Watson, he murmured. The ink on the corner of the journal, fresher than the rest. It was tampered with after the fact. I nodded slowly, not quite as certain as he. You believe the journal was planted? No. I believe it was updated, possibly even bait. The watchmaker was trying to warn us, or mislead us. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered and handed Holmes a small, wrapped parcel. This came for you by courier. No sender, she said with a frown. Holmes took the parcel with a gloved hand, eyes scanning it with caution. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a pocket watch, an old one. Its face was cracked, its casing tarnished. Inside, Folded beneath the timepiece was a note written in tiny, cramped handwriting. Time is our only ally. The truth lies not in minutes past, but in seconds undone. Seek the Bell Foundry. Holmes raised an eyebrow, then glanced at me. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Watson, coat and hat, were visiting Whitechapel. Whitechapel, at that hour, was choked in fog and soot. The streets were slick from a recent rain, and a chill wind whipped between the narrow alleys. The Bell Foundry loomed like a forgotten relic from another century, once the birthplace of some of England's most famous bells, including Big Ben. It had long been shuttered, left to rust and shadow. The massive iron doors groaned as Holmes pushed them open. Inside it was darker still, lit only by the pale shafts of daylight slanting through the dust-coated windows. The scent of rust, oil, and age hung in the air like incense. Holmes moved with purpose, scanning the floorboards, the walls, the machinery. We passed long-abandoned molds, massive bell forms, and a rusted smelter. "There," he said at last, pointing to a workshop at the back. Its door bore a plaque, "Horology and Assembly." We entered. The room was cluttered with watch parts, gears, springs, decades of meticulous labor abandoned mid-motion. On the central workbench lay a blueprint. Holmes unfolded it with delicate fingers. "A bell with no clapper," he murmured. "Designed to never ring." I leaned over his shoulder. "Why would someone build such a thing?" "To conceal," he replied. "To mislead sound itself. Or to trap it." He traced the lines of the blueprint, lips tightening in thought. Then his hand stopped on a particular notation, a signature, almost invisible, 2 initials. AC. Holmes stiffened. "What is it?" He held up the blueprint and turned it in the light. "Aloysius Carmichael." The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's tone chilled the room. A master horologist. Vanished 15 years ago. A recluse who once built custom escapements for the Royal Observatory. Brilliant. Paranoid. And a known associate of... "Wait," I interrupted. "You mean he's a watchmaker?" Holmes hesitated, then nodded. "He was at one time. But this suggests he may still be alive. Or someone has taken his legacy." We searched the workroom thoroughly. Behind a tall cabinet, Holmes found a hidden compartment. Inside was a case of pocket watches, each engraved with different coordinates and dates. "These are not for telling time," he whispered. "They are records, messages, and perhaps schedules." He examined one engraved with the numbers 51.5136 degrees north, 0.0983 degrees west, 217. "St. Bartholomew's Church," he muttered. "And the time, less than 2 hours from now." "She came in the rain," Sir Lyle said finally, "drenched. Her gloves soaked through. I never saw a face so white. She pleaded, wept. She offered money I knew she didn't have. I still hear her voice sometimes. But the law was the law." He turned to face us, anguish plain. If that child grew to hate us, to seek vengeance, I couldn't blame him. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And if he returned not just to seek vengeance, but to destroy from within? Sir Lyle looked startled. "You believe this man, this killer, is Elias?" "I believe someone close to you is," Holmes said. "And if that's the case, then they've had years to prepare, to become someone you trust." Sir Lyle collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I'll need the names of everyone employed in your house for more than 10 years, Holmes said. "Servants, groundskeepers, estate managers, anyone with access to your family records or personal life." "I'll send them," Sir Lyle whispered. As we walked back through the early dusk, Holmes said nothing for some time. When he did speak, it was more to himself than to me. Every motive leaves a footprint. Grief wears shoes of silence. Revenge wears boots of blood. I let the words hang there. Then I asked, "And Miss Greaves?" "She knew the mother," Holmes replied. "She may have even loved her." "And our Elias?" Holmes glanced at me. "He is closer than anyone realizes. And I fear, Watson, that he is not finished." Chapter 12. A Portrait in the Dust. The sun had begun to set behind the sharp angles of Calhoun House, casting long shadows over the cracked veranda and deepening the mystery that seemed to curl around every brick of this state. Detective Blaze stood at the threshold of the drawing room once more, staring at the same faded oil painting of Eleanor Calhoun that had watched silently over this household for 3 decades. It wasn't just a portrait anymore. It was a message. Blaze turned to Claire, who trailed him nervously, arms crossed tightly. "Have you ever noticed anything odd about this painting?" Claire frowned. "Odd? Just that everyone in this family acts like it's sacred. My aunt swore it used to hang in a different room years ago, but no one could prove it." Blaze stepped closer, studying the frame, the brushwork, the slight discoloration at the lower right corner. "Did your aunt say why she thought it had moved?" She said Eleanor's eyes seemed to follow her more intensely in the new location. She hated coming in here after that. Blaze glanced behind the frame. It had been carefully rehung, odd for something that had apparently been here so long. He gently tugged on the edge. Nothing. He drew a pocket knife from his coat and carefully wedged it between the frame and wall. There was a sudden soft click, and then a low, creaking sound. The painting pivoted outward on a hidden hinge. Behind it was a shallow recess, and nestled inside, a thin, leather-bound journal coated in dust. Claire gasped. Blaze retrieved the journal, careful not to smudge any potential prints. He opened it delicately, scanning the pages by the waning sunlight filtering through the tall windows. Eleanor Calhoun's looping handwriting filled the yellowed sheets. The entries dated back nearly 30 years. August 2nd, 1997. He promised me the world, but left me nothing but debt and disgrace. If they knew the truth, they would bury him and me with him. But I've hidden it. The letters, the papers. They will not find them unless they know where to look. Unless they know me truly. Blaze read aloud slowly, each word sharpening the puzzle's outline. "There are more of these, Claire. I bet everything on it." Claire looked pale. "You think she was hiding evidence of some crime?" Blaze nodded. "And whatever it was, someone in this house doesn't want uncovered." They sat in tense silence as he flipped through a few more pages. Entries that hinted at secret meetings, financial manipulation, betrayal from someone named T.H. It was enough to throw suspicion far and wide. Then a sound stopped him cold, a soft clink of glass from the hallway. Blaze's eyes narrowed. He rose silently and gestured for Claire to stay back. He stepped into the corridor, his footsteps soundless on the faded carpet. The air was thicker here. No breeze, no noise save for the distant ticking of an ancient grandfather clock. Then, from the side door near the library, came a whisper, too deliberate, too timed. Blaze eased forward, hand near his concealed revolver. The door creaked open, and a shadow slipped inside. Blaze lunged forward, grabbing the intruder's arm and twisting hard. A startled yelp echoed. "Let go! You're hurting me!" cried a voice, female young. He turned her into the light. It was Violet, the youngest of the Calhoun grandchildren. Violet. Claire had followed, stunned. "What the hell are you doing sneaking around?" Violet's eyes flicked between them, caught and cornered but not entirely rattled. I just came back from my charger. I left it in the library." Blaze didn't let go. "At dusk? Without telling anyone." "I didn't think anyone would notice," Violet muttered, pulling her wrist away. "I heard voices and panicked. Why are you acting like I did something wrong?" Claire opened her mouth, but Blaze interjected. "No one's accusing you, yet. But if you have any idea what this is," he held up the journal, "now would be the time to speak." Violet's expression shifted at the sight of it, brief but unmistakable. She recognized it. "I don't know anything," she whispered, suddenly pale. "I swear." Blaze didn't press further, not yet. Instead, he tucked the journal into his coat and turned back to Claire. "This house is crawling with secrets. Whatever Eleanor hid, she didn't just hide it from her enemies. She hid it from her family, too." Claire looked like she might be sick. "How much danger are we in, Blaze?" He looked out the tall hallway window, where the last light of day bled across the sky like a wound. "Enough that I hope you're ready to learn the truth about your family," he said quietly, "because it's been dying to be told." Chapter 13, The Voice and Photograph. The lantern's flame fluttered as Blaze held up the photograph Charlotte had unearthed from beneath the floorboard. It was old and cracked, but the figures in it were unmistakable. Mrs. Estelle Langford, younger by decades, standing beside a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to the portrait in the hallway, Arthur Langford. Yet the third figure between them was the one that stole the breath from Blaze's lungs. The Reverend? Charlotte whispered. Blaze nodded. And he's not wearing his collar. He looks like a friend, or more. Charlotte tilted her head, eyes narrowing. You think he had an affair with Mrs. Langford? Blaze didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the photo into his notebook and gestured toward the hallway. Let's ask him ourselves. They found Reverend Whitlock in the drawing room, seated near the fire, his face half in shadow. His hands were folded, knuckles white against his black robes. He looked up slowly as they entered. I suspected you'd be coming, he said, voice dry. Blaze stepped closer. Reverend, how long have you been involved with the Langford family? A flicker or something. Remorse, maybe, crossed the Reverend's face. Since I was a boy, Arthur was like an older brother. Estelle, well, she was the kind of woman who turned heads. Even mine. Charlotte blinked. So it's true? You and she. He raised a hand. Nothing happened. Nothing that would disgrace my vows. But the feelings were there. That photograph was taken the summer Arthur returned from France. He brought back a bitterness I didn't recognize. He began drinking, isolating himself. Estelle would cry to me, but I could only offer words. Blaze glanced toward the fire. And what are the journals? The ones hidden away in the bedroom drawer? The Reverend went pale. You found them? Yes. Arthur suspected something, didn't he? He did. But not about Estelle and me. He believed someone was after his inheritance. A blackmailer, perhaps. He wrote in feverish bursts, then locked the pages away. I told him to see a doctor, but he wouldn't. He said there were voices in the walls, someone watching. Charlotte whispered. The photograph. Arthur's face looks like he's trying to smile, but his eyes are elsewhere, distracted. Reverend Whitlock nodded. He was already slipping. 2 weeks later, he vanished. His body was found in the lake. They ruled it suicide. But you never believed that, did you? Blaze asked softly. No, Whitlock said, voice breaking. I believed he was murdered. And I believed Estelle knew. The silence lingered. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance. Blaze stepped forward, lowering his voice. There's more, Reverend. The voice. The same one Arthur heard. We heard it too. Whitlock blinked. You mean? Charlotte interjected. Someone's been using the passageways. The walls are hollow in places. There are small holes bored into rooms, perfect for spying or whispering. Whitlock stood suddenly. There is one room you haven't searched. The tower. It was sealed after Arthur's death. No one's been allowed inside. Blaze and Charlotte exchanged a glance. Show us, Blaze said. The tower loomed above the house like a sentinel half forgotten. Reverend Whitlock retrieved an ancient iron key from a drawer in the study and led them up a narrow spiral staircase. Cobwebs clung to corners, and the air smelled of mildew and dust. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, the room was circular and windowless save for one high slit in the stone. Furniture covered in white sheets lined the walls. In the center stood a writing desk, untouched. Blaze pulled back the sheet and examined the surface. Dusty, but something caught his eye, a faint fingerprint. Charlotte found a small trunk beneath the bed. Inside were wax cylinders, the kind used in old phonographs. What is this? She asked. The Reverend stepped forward, trembling. Arthur's last recordings. He said he was documenting his descent. Should anyone believe him? Blaze found the phonograph in the corner and set a cylinder carefully into place. As it crackled to life, a voice, raspy and strained, filled the room. They come at night. They whisper through the walls. I cannot sleep. Estelle hides things. Even Whitlock has secrets. They all lie. If I disappear, know this wasn't madness. It was murder. The recording cut off in a burst of static. Blaze turned to the others. We were wrong to assume this case was buried with time. Someone tried to erase Arthur Langford, but he left behind a trail. Charlotte nodded. And we've only just begun to follow it. From the sliver window above, moonlight spilled across the desk, illuminating something carved faintly into the wood. A single word, brother. Chapter 14, The Gloved Hand. A single thread was unraveling the tapestry of lies that had once blanketed the De Vere estate in heavy shadows. Holmes, more contemplative than ever, stared at the fire in the drawing room, its flickering light casting elongated shadows across the floor. Inspector Lestrade sat opposite him, flipping through his notepad, brows furrowed in frustration. "I'll admit," said Lestrade, "I've never had a case where everyone seems to be lying but no one seems to have murdered anyone." Holmes gave a dry smile. "On the contrary, my dear Lestrade, someone most certainly murdered Lord Alistair de Vere. The trouble is, everyone believes their lies are harmless, when in truth they each hold a splinter of the killing blow." Watson entered at that moment, his expression troubled. "That maid, Clarice, I spoke to her again in private. She's terrified of something or someone. When I asked about the missing gloves, she turned pale and refused to continue." "Ah," said Holmes, "the gloves again. An item far too mundane to arouse suspicion. Unless, of course, they're missing for a very particular reason." Lestrade leaned forward. "You think the gloves were used in the murder?" Holmes stood and began pacing. "More than that, I believe they are the key. Consider the post-mortem bruising along Lord de Vere's jaw. The grip was precise. Someone held his mouth shut, not simply to silence him, but to prevent a scream during the injection. And yet, there were no fingerprints. Only the faint impression of a right-handed grip through cloth. Cloth, such as a pair of fitted gloves. Watson's eyes widened. "You think the killer took them to avoid being identified later?" Holmes turned to him. "Yes, but not because they feared we'd find fingerprints on the gloves. No, they feared we'd realize whose gloves they were." A beat of silence followed. Lestrade scratched his head. "So, who do the gloves belong to, then?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we're about to find out." He summoned Clarice once more, and this time, instead of questions, he showed her a small brooch. "Have you seen this before?" he asked gently. Clarice gasped. That was in Lady Margaret's drawer, the one she told me never to touch." Holmes nodded gravely and turned to Lestrade. "Then it's time we have a final word with Lady Margaret." Lady Margaret sat poised, elegant as ever, her expression calm but defensive. "I hope you're not here to accuse me of anything, Mr. Holmes." "Not accused," Holmes replied, "merely to clarify." He held out the brooch. "This you kept hidden, along with the gloves that vanished the day Lord de Vere was murdered." She stiffened but said nothing. "Your husband was planning to disinherit your son," Holmes continued, "and strip you of the last financial ties to this estate. Your affair with the groundskeeper, yes, I know, was to be exposed in court. You stood to lose everything." Her face blanched, but she still said nothing. "It was not premeditated, was it?" Holmes continued, his voice almost sympathetic. "You were arguing. He said something cruel. You lost control. The morphine was supposed to calm him, but it didn't work quickly enough. So you held his mouth, held it too tightly, and when it was over, you panicked. You hid the gloves." Finally, Lady Margaret spoke, softly, almost inaudibly. "It was never supposed to happen like that. I only wanted him to sleep through the solicitor's arrival. Just a few hours. That was all." Watson looked away. Lestrade pulled out his notebook with the heaviness of duty. "I loved him once," she whispered, tears brimming. "But he turned bitter, controlling. I was drowning." Holmes merely bowed his head. "The truth is rarely neat, Lady Margaret, but it is the only thing that can set us free." As Lestrade read her rights and led her away, Holmes turned back to the fire, his expression unreadable. "A sad business," Watson said quietly. "No villains, only desperation." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, but justice, in all its coldness, must still be served." And with that, the great mystery of the De Vere manor began its long descent into memory. But Holmes, ever vigilant, knew this case would leave its mark, not for its complexity, but for the quiet, human tragedy that lingered in its wake. Chapter 15, The Cipher in the Margins. The gaslight flickered weakly in the scriptorium as Poirot sat hunched over the scorched remnants of the cook's journal. Hastings paced the stone corridor outside the chamber, the chill of the Abbey's breath seeping through his boots. Beyond the broken stained-glass windows, the wind howled like a distant lament. Poirot's eyes narrowed on the smudged ink, each page more damaged than the last. Yet something peculiar caught his attention, not in the entries, but in the margins. Tiny dots, faint indentations, as if made by a fine needle. At first glance they seemed random, but Poirot, with his reverence for detail, saw the rhythm, a pattern. He called softly, "Hastings, mon ami. Come, regardes." Hastings stepped in, brushing the coal from his coat. Another recipe for rabbit stew? Poirot ignored the jest. "Non, observe the margins. What do you see?" Hastings squinted. "Smudges, dust, possibly pinholes?" "Precisely," Poirot whispered. "A cipher, an old one, possibly Masonic, or from an earlier secret society. The cook, Madame Therese, she was not simply chronicling meals. She was passing messages." "To whom?" Hastings asked. Poirot tapped the edge of the page. "That, my friend, is the question. But let us not underestimate the mind that could weave invisible text between crusts of pie and stockpots." He gently pulled the next page toward him. The holes continued, a series of punctuations in the silence, forming something. Poirot drew out a sheet of thin paper and, using a candle, pressed it lightly over the indentations. With charcoal dust, the cipher began to reveal itself. Not words, coordinates. Hastings leaned closer. "That's not a sentence." "No, it is a map." They traced it together, Poirot's delicate fingers gliding from margin to margin. The points aligned in a spiral, not geographical but symbolic. A path, perhaps, through the Abbey grounds. Then Hastings remembered that old spiral maze in the south garden, the one the caretaker said hadn't walked in years. Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "Oui, I believe our missing piece may lie within." An hour later, lanterns in hand, Poirot and Hastings braved the night wind. The Abbey loomed behind them like a sleeping beast. Ahead, the overgrown maze, now only faintly outlined under the moon's glow, waited like an ancient secret. Each step crackled over dead ivy and frostbitten grass. Poirot followed the cipher's curve, turning left, then right, sometimes walking in reverse. Hastings followed silently, reluctant to disturb Poirot's trance-like state. In the heart of the spiral, they found a cracked stone plinth, moss-eaten and forgotten. Poirot knelt and pressed a gloved hand against the top. It gave slightly, then clicked. The stone slid back, revealing a hollow within. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small brass box. Poirot lifted it gently. Hastings held the lantern closer. "Do you think this is what Therese was hiding?" Poirot nodded gravely. "Let's return to the warmth before we open this. Whatever secrets it holds have waited long enough." Back in the study, with the fire now crackling and the shadows retreating, Poirot unlatched the box. Inside lay parchment, yellowed and brittle but still legible. The first page bore a symbol, a circle intersected by a triangle. Hastings gasped. "That's the same symbol burned into the abbess's wooden cross." Poirot turned the page. It was a confession, not by the abbess, but by another woman, Jean-Marie du Clairvaux. She described a conspiracy within the Abbey, one spanning generations. A secret passage between abbeys in different provinces. Smuggled documents. Hidden heresies. But most damning, an account of a pact formed with a noble family for protection and silence. She was the abbess's great-aunt, Poirot muttered, which means the sins of the past are not so far behind. Hastings frowned. "And what does this have to do with the murder?" Poirot closed the box slowly. "Everything, my friend. This manuscript, buried for a century, threatened to unearth the power structure that still thrives. And someone killed to keep it hidden. Outside, a bell tolled twice, the midnight call. But inside, the clock of revelation had already begun its countdown. Chapter 16, The Whispering Walls. The heavy silence that had fallen upon the manor after the revelation of Adeline's forged letters was soon replaced with subtle tension, a breath collectively held by everyone in the drawing room. Inspector Mallory paced in measured steps, while Holmes sat unmoving in a high-backed chair, his fingers tented beneath his chin. Only Watson's eyes drifted between the faces present. Sir Edgar, pale and rigid. Clara, her eyes red but wide with alertness. Mr. Renfield, fidgeting with his cufflinks. And the ever-silent housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, hovering like a shadow behind them all. "We've danced around the fire long enough," Holmes finally said, breaking the stillness. "What lies hidden now is not who forged those letters. Adeline was clever, but careless in haste, but why? And it isn't why that the truth of this crime is buried." Inspector Mallory glanced at Holmes with narrowed eyes. "You still believe this was not suicide?" Holmes stood. "I believe it less with every breath. The more we strip away the red herrings, the clearer the outline becomes. Adeline's forgery was not to create affection. It was to manipulate action. She wanted someone to do something, perhaps to trust, or to act rashly." Renfield scoffed lightly. She was unstable. Everyone knew she lived in a world of emotional highs and lows. She could have sent those letters just to play with us. Holmes looked at him sharply. "And yet you still kept them, Mr. Renfield. One wonders what use a lawyer has for old affections, unless they serve as leverage." Before Renfield could respond, Holmes turned to Sir Edgar. "And you, sir, I presume you've not left the manor in several weeks." "That is correct," Edgar replied warily. "And yet the postmark on the final letter received by Clara was stamped from Bath," Holmes said, lifting an envelope delicately. "A place none of you have visited recently, except for one member of the household." His gaze landed on Mrs. Potts. The housekeeper flinched. "No more riddles, Holmes," said Watson, standing beside him. "If there's something you know—" "There is something I suspect," Holmes interrupted, then walked to the hearth, where the fire had long since turned to embers. "But we need confirmation. Tell me, Mrs. Potts, what were you doing in Bath the day before Miss Adeline's death?" I went to visit my niece." "She's ill," the woman replied, eyes flickering. "Sir Edgar gave me leave." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Yet Clara told us she noticed a gap in the housekeeping schedule and found it odd. I confirmed your niece lives in London, not Bath. So I'll ask again, what were you doing there?" Mrs. Potts said nothing, but her hands clenched tightly against her apron. Holmes stepped closer. "You were posting letters. On someone's behalf. That much is clear. But whose?" For a long moment, it seemed she might collapse. Then, in a strained whisper, she answered, "Miss Adeline gave me those envelopes. She said if I loved her, I'd do it. She was frightened, sir." "Frightened of what?" "She never said. But she mentioned someone was watching her. Not Sir Edgar. Not Mr. Renfield. Someone else. She said she felt eyes even in the garden." Holmes turned, the firelight catching in his eyes. Now we arrive at the truth's edge. Inspector Mallory frowned. "If Adeline was frightened, that leans back towards suicide, doesn't it?" "Not quite," Holmes said. "Fear can be a motive for many things, especially secrets, especially when something or someone is about to be exposed." He gestured to Watson. "Come with me. There's something I must show you in the north wing." As the two men departed, silence returned to the room. Their footsteps echoed down the dim corridors, past oil paintings and the faded visages of dead aristocrats. They stopped before a door, narrow and dust-covered. "This," Holmes said, "is the only room not shown to us during our arrival tour. Odd. For such a proud estate." Watson gave the knob a turn. It opened with a creak. Inside was a sparse study, books stacked in haphazard piles, maps pinned to the wall, and in the center, a single desk. Upon it lay a black-bound journal. Holmes flipped it open and scanned the pages. "Notes in Adeline's handwriting," he murmured. "Or rather, copies. Transcripts. This isn't her journal. It's someone else's. She was tracking them, recording private conversations. He held up a page to Watson, whose eyes widened. These are records of discussions that took place between Sir Edgar and Mr. Renfield regarding estate funds. Watson whispered. And this page implies an illegal transfer to an account in Switzerland. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Now we understand. Adeline discovered something rotten in this house, and she paid for it. He tucked the journal under his arm. Let's return. The walls have whispered long enough. Time for them to speak. As they exited the room, the hallway behind them felt darker, tighter, like the secrets they now carried were reaching out with spectral hands. But Holmes pressed forward with resolve. In the drawing room, all turned as they re-entered. Holmes placed the journal on the table. The next chapter begins now, he said, and someone here is about to be unmasked. Chapter 17, The Ink Beneath the Ashes. The fire had been extinguished, but its residue lingered. Charred pages blistered shelves, and the acrid stench of secrets nearly turned to smoke. As the last embers crackled in the hearth, Poirot stood unmoving before the blackened manuscript remains. Chief Inspector Lestrade barked orders to constables now combing through the debris, while Hastings retrieved a cracked magnifying lens from what had once been the study desk. What was it, Poirot? Hastings asked quietly, brushing soot from his jacket. Why would someone go to such lengths just to burn old pages? Poirot crouched carefully beside the wreckage, his gloved fingers lifting a scorched but partially intact sheet. The ink had bled in places, warped by heat, but some lines remained legible. He squinted, lips pressing into a thoughtful line. Because, mon ami, he replied, what was once written cannot be unwritten, but it can be concealed. He held the page up to the light. This manuscript, it was never about mere fiction. It was a confession, thinly veiled in story, perhaps, but still, truth masked as narrative. Hastings stepped closer. You think Winthrop wrote down the truth about the murder? No, said Poirot, shaking his head. Not Winthrop. Someone else. Someone far more invested in shaping the tale and its ending. Just then, Constable Marsh returned, face grim. Sir, he said, addressing Poirot, we found this beneath the floorboards behind the desk. He handed Poirot a wooden box, locked but hastily resealed with wire. Poirot examined it with interest. The craftsmanship is curious, he murmured. French hinges, English wood, and this... He pointed to the crest etched on the lid, a falcon perched upon a quill, surrounded by laurel. I have seen this symbol before in Cairo. Cairo. Hastings blinked. But what connection could an Egyptian archive have with murder in Sussex? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, you forget how often the sins of one continent ripple through another. The symbol belongs to a clandestine society of historians, those who safeguard lost truths, and sometimes silence them. He pulled a hairpin from his pocket, borrowed discreetly from his foldings by earlier, and began working at the lock. It clicked open within seconds. Inside were 6 neatly bound pages that hadn't burned with the rest. Poirot leafed through them, eyes darting line by line. His brows furrowed, then rose with surprise. Regard as Hastings. These are not fiction at all. They are records, diaries, receipts, and this... He held up a faded photograph. It showed 3 figures, a young Clara Winthrop, much younger and thinner, and a third man whom Poirot recognized instantly. Dr. Kellyver, he whispered. Years younger, but unmistakable. So they knew each other? Hastings asked. Before all this began? Mais oui, Poirot said slowly. They were collaborators. But then something changed. Something fractured the alliance and led to betrayal. Hastings pointed to the final page. What's this? Poirot read aloud. He came to me again tonight. Whispered through the crack in the door that if I told the truth, the whole truth, he would make certain I was never seen again. I know now what must be done. I will hide the real manuscript where none shall look, for none would believe a cookbook's index holds a tale of murder. The cookbook? Hastings exclaimed. The index? Poirot stood quickly, eyes alight. The key is in the wording. The index does not merely reference recipes. It references secrets. Clara's coded annotations must point to entries not meant for the palate, but the conscience. And Kellyver? Hastings asked. his tone suddenly grave. "Do you think he read the manuscript?" "I think," Poirot said slowly, "he read every word, and knew that if it ever came to light, he would be undone." A knock interrupted them. Lestrade stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Poirot," he said, "you want to hear this." They followed him to the drawing-room, where Miss Follingsby sat with shawl wrapped tightly around her. Her hands trembled as she spoke. I didn't know it would go so far. I thought it was just theatrics. Stories. But then the fire and the scream." Poirot approached gently. "Mademoiselle, begin at the start. What was your role in this story?" She swallowed hard. "Winthrop hired me to type out the manuscript. He paid well and gave strict instructions. No copies, no summaries, just the exact text. But one night I read ahead, and I realized he wasn't inventing the tale, he was retelling it." She glanced at Poirot. "You were right. He was hiding something in plain sight. And someone else, someone who had much to lose, knew it." Poirot leaned in. "Who, mademoiselle?" But her lips trembled into silence. And Poirot, noticing the flicker of her eyes toward the hallway, turned sharply. The hallway where Dr. Kellyver had stood only moments before, now empty. "Too late," Poirot muttered. "He's making his move." Without a word, he bolted into the corridor, Hastings close behind. The house had grown too still, the shadows too long. Somewhere beyond the staircase, a door slammed shut. Poirot whispered, "The final act begins." Chapter 18. The Impossible Made Plain. The study was deathly quiet. Inspector Mallory leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed, as Holmes, now standing by the cold fireplace, slowly turned to face the room. The storm had passed, and the soft hum of morning traffic floated into the window, as if the world outside was unaware of the murder, the deception, and the brilliant trap that had just been sprung. Lady Constance, pale and rigid, sat on the edge of the settee, eyes fixed on Holmes. Behind her, Gregory Harrow's expression had shifted from smug indifference to growing panic. Holmes, in his usual unhurried tone, began the final unraveling. "Lady Constance, when you insisted the door to Sir Albert's study had remained locked, and yet no key was ever found, I was intrigued. A locked room, no sign of forced entry, and a pistol found by the victim's hand, yet no powder burns, and no suicide note. Curious, was it not?" She nodded stiffly, unsure whether to speak. It became evident rather early that we were dealing with a staged suicide. But what troubled me most was the impossible nature of the crime. A man murdered in a sealed room, no window exit, no alternate passage, an illusion of inaccessibility. He paused, then turned toward the painting over the mantelpiece. With a gloved hand, he lifted it to reveal a small brass panel embedded in the wall. There was, in fact, another way in. This house, like many in Mayfair, was built with service shafts and dumbwaiters, now mostly disused or sealed. But Sir Albert had retained access to a legacy passage that once connected the study to the conservatory below. "Harrow, you knew of it. Your fathers were made reference to the estate's secret infrastructure." Gregory Harrow's mouth opened slightly. "This is preposterous. That shaft hasn't been opened in decades." "Oh, it was opened. I had Watson and Mallory examine it this morning. Fresh scuff marks. Dust disturbed. It's quite narrow, but just enough for a man of your build." Harrow swallowed hard, but Holmes continued without mercy. "You murdered your uncle for two reasons. First, because he intended to cut you off entirely from the inheritance. Second, because he had discovered your embezzlement from a family trust. Large sums routed through shell accounts in the Channel Islands. When he confronted you, you begged him for time. Instead, you used that time to kill him." "I wasn't even in the house that night," Harrow snapped, but Holmes raised a finger. "Incorrect. You returned after dinner. The servants were gone, Lady Constance asleep. You entered through the conservatory, used the shaft, and emerged in the study. You drugged your uncle's port. He was old, tired, and alone. Then you shot him. You wore gloves, staged the scene to look like suicide, left the pistol near his hand, and climbed back down the shaft. You even locked the study door behind you from the inside, using the old bolt and twine trick through the shaft's opening. Then where's your proof?" Harrow spat. Holmes' smile was thin and sharp. "I knew you'd return to clean your tracks. So I set a trap. While we interviewed Lady Constance in the drawing room yesterday, you attempted to remove the bolt from inside the shaft, intending to destroy the evidence of your passage. But I had Watson place a strip of fresh wax at the rim. It now bears your fingerprint. And there's more, Watson." Dr. Watson stepped forward, holding a small envelope. "The revolver bears no prints, but under the grip panel, we found a scrap of torn cloth, gray wool, same as Harrow's coat from that night, likely torn during the hurried escape." Lady Constance let out a soft gasp, but Harrow was already sinking back in his chair. Holmes approached him, voice now low and final. "You committed the perfect locked room murder, Harrow." "Almost. But every illusion leaves behind the fingerprints of its maker. Yours were simply too clumsy for the stage you chose." Mallory stepped in, signaling the constables by the door. Harrow did not resist as they moved to handcuff him, his face now drained of all arrogance. As he was led away, Lady Constance looked up at Holmes with weary gratitude. "And I thought I knew everyone in this house," she said quietly. "Even my own nephew." Holmes offered her a small nod. "People wear many masks, Lady Constance. The trick is knowing when the face you see is not the truth." As Holmes and Watson stepped into the morning light of Baker Street, a fresh wind stirred the city awake. Another impossible crime had been made plain, not by force, but by logic, patience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Watson, walking beside his old friend, glanced over. "You had me fooled until the very end, Holmes." Holmes gave the barest flicker of a smile. "That, my dear Watson, is what makes the game worth playing.